Hello and welcome to our special program, Putin's War. I'm Stan Grant. Well, Russian forces are closing in on Ukrainian cities as the death toll mounts. Paratroopers are storming Ukraine's second most populous city, Kharkiv. Our Europe correspondent, Isabella Higgins, is in Lviv. And Isabella, just give us a sense of where you are now. I understand there were air raid sirens not long ago and how people are dealing with this right now.
Yeah, that's right, Stan. I'm here in Lviv, which is the western city in Ukraine, where many people are coming because it's really seen as a safe haven. The reason I'm standing out here on the street outside my hotel is because air raid sirens just went off here, and as soon as they go off, anyone in the city is being told to go to shelter. Now, thankfully for us, it wasn't too serious here. We were downstairs in the lobby waiting to be taken to the basement, but we got the all clear. All the guests were allowed to go back upstairs within about half an hour. This is sort of becoming part of daily life here in this city. At least once a day, these air raid sirens go off, and people in a huge rush will head to a bomb shelter. If you're in a cafe or a restaurant, often they'll take you downstairs. In hotels, there's evacuation plans ready. So that's sort of part of life here in Lviv, and thankfully there hasn't been any explosions or attacks that have followed in this city, but many of the people who are here have come from places like Kharkiv, Kyiv, or even the Donbass region, and they heard these sirens go off and then they heard explosions follow. So it triggers a sense of panic, a reminder of what they've been through. It's quite sad when we're down here. Sometimes you can see people shaking. It brings back the memories of what they have lived through in recent days. So that's why we're here out in the street. We've just been released to come out. And as I say, this is becoming part of everyday life. You know, we're not on the conflict line, we're not right there on the front line, but we're still living in a country that's in a very real conflict.
Just a couple of things, Isabella. I've been hearing from various government sources, the Kharkiv governor talking about the level of casualties that the Russians have suffered. And then can you tell us again as well about what people are telling you about the resolve that they have here and how long they fear this may last?
Yeah, that's right, Stan. That besieged eastern city of Kharkiv, it's come under another intense attack. They say that dozens of civilians throughout the course of this invasion have died already. They estimate about 352 civilians have died, which is incredibly sad. Of course, the real number could be much higher. Today, when those paratroopers landed, when they targeted what we believe to be a police station and also that hospital, the mayor of that city has said that Russian troops surrendered their weapons, that they were able to claim some tanks. And it feels as if this whole Russian offensive isn't quite going the way that Moscow has planned, that they've underestimated the Ukrainian resistance. Of course, as well, there's that huge envoy of trucks and tanks not too far from Kyiv. Many thought they would be in the city within hours, but it appears that they've been hampered, that they're suffering through breakdown. So that Russian offensive is moving slower than people expected, and it's only strengthening the Ukrainian resolve. You can see it and you can feel it here when you're in the city. You walk around these streets, and on street corners you've got grandmothers making Molotov cocktails, you've got young people coming together, making camouflage nets, doing everything they can to help. And people here who have chosen to stay say they feel a sense of duty, that they know they'll be here to the bitter end, that this has only emboldened their belief in their country, in a democratic country, that they're happy to see their country moving towards Europe, moving towards the West. And certainly they are very much in support of their president, Vladimir Zelensky, who has refused to concede or surrender to this Russian aggression, who's remained in the capital of Kyiv. He's certainly, it feels like, become a celebrity, a superstar, an icon in this country, and many are feeding off his resolve, it feels like.
Isabella, thank you so much for that. Isabella Higgins joining us live there from Lviv. Well, for months, President Putin denied he would invade his neighbour, and then he unleashed his forces by land, air and sea on Ukraine, shattering peace and in Europe and also redefining Russia's sphere of influence. When Vladimir Putin met Angela Merkel, he knew her weakness. The German Chancellor was afraid of dogs, so Putin whistled in a black Labrador. just to intimidate her. Putin is in the intimidation business. He learnt the lessons early. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin was born on October 7, 1952 in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. His father fought in the Red Army in World War II. His grandfather was a cook for Stalin and Lenin. The young Vladimir eventually studied law and became a spy, joining the KGB, the Soviet intelligence service, in his early 20s. In the 1980s, he served in East Germany and saw the Berlin Wall fall. 2 years later, the Soviet flag was lowered for the last time in Red Square. The Cold War had ended, but Putin's political career was only beginning. He would call the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Not that he pines for a return of communism, but he dreams of restoring Russian glory. Putin was an advisor to the mayor of Leningrad. Later, in the 1990s, he moved to Moscow. New Russian leader Boris Yeltsin promoted him to deputy chief of presidential staff, then the head of the FSB, Russia's spy agency. Yeltsin appointed Putin his successor. By 2000, Yeltsin had resigned and Putin was president. He has been in power ever since, either as president or prime minister. What drives Vladimir Putin? He is the man of action, quick to show off his physique, on horseback, in the snow, ice skating, the black belt in judo. He dreams of Russian glory. He has turned away from Europe, wary of NATO expansion. As more and more nations have joined NATO, he has pushed back. In 2008, he invaded the former Soviet state of Georgia to prop up 2 breakaway provinces. In 2014, he annexed Crimea, redrawing the borders of Europe. At the same time, he has expanded Russia's reach, intervening in the Syrian civil war, propping up the besieged leader Bashar al-Assad. It is said he is consumed with vengeance against the West. He senses his moment, believing the West is weak. He has drawn closer to China, signing a new no-limits pact with Xi Jinping. Vladimir Putin believes he is a great man of history. Now in Ukraine, he seeks to bend the world to his will. Well, former Australian Foreign Minister Julie Bishop has been face-to-face with the Russian president and joins me now from Adelaide. It's good to have you with us, and you are someone who has sat across the table from Vladimir Putin. What was that experience like?
Well, indeed, it was more than just sitting across the table. It was in late 2014, after Russia had downed Malaysian airline MH17 and had denied all responsibility for it. We were in a propaganda battle against the Russians to get resolutions through the UN Security Council to ensure that we could enter Ukraine. I spent a number of weeks in Ukraine working with others to get the bodies from what was essentially a war zone and to get an independent investigation underway. At every step, Russia tried to thwart our efforts. Our Prime Minister at the time, Tony Abbott, quite famously said that the next time he saw President Putin, he would shirt front him. Well, as it turned out, I was the next Australian official to be in his presence. It was the Asia-Europe Summit in Milan, and only leaders were allowed in the meeting room, so only presidents or prime ministers, but they made an exception for me. There were only, say, 30 leaders there, and at one moment, the security around President Putin left him momentarily. And I seized that moment and hot-footed around the meeting table, and he was seated, and I approached him, introduced myself. He knew who I was. He stood up and we moved away from the microphones. I told him Australia's position in relation to MH17. I talked about Russia's invasion of Ukraine and that this was not a civil war as it had been portrayed, but actually Russian soldiers were in eastern Ukraine and they had to allow us in to retrieve the bodies and to carry out an investigation to hold those responsible to account. He listened to everything I said. His eyes did not ever leave my face. He didn't blink, not once, and he stared. He asked a couple of questions quite respectfully, and we obviously agreed to disagree. I felt that I'd put Australia's position most firmly to him. And in his steely, determined way, he put his head to one side and said, "So this is what you call a shirt front." He spoke perfect English, but he was, in a way, mocking me. I said, "No, Mr. President, it's more of a buttonholing, really." But at that moment, his security came up and the conversation finished. But I got the sense of a man who is utterly determined to have his way. He was formidable, he wasn't rude, he was quite respectful. In fact, I remember saying to DFAT officers afterwards that no KGB agent should be that respectful and almost charming. But he is absolutely ruthless in his determination to restore Russian power and prestige.
So, drawing on that experience, where does he go now? What do you think would be going through his mind as he sees this invasion continue to unfold?
Clearly this has been years in the planning, not just months but years, because it was 8 years ago when Russian troops first invaded eastern Ukraine under the guise of being separatists. So for 8 years he has been biding his time, and I don't believe that Ukraine's resistance has not been factored into his calculus. He is a gambler, he's a risk taker, but I believe that he has expected resistance, maybe not as much as the brave Ukrainians are demonstrating. But he would know that the West, NATO, the United States and its allies believe this to be an act of aggression. He would know that we believe it to be illegal. It is in breach of the UN Charter. And of course, Russia, as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, has a responsibility to uphold that charter, uphold international peace and security. He's factored all that into account. But his determination to ensure that NATO does not encroach on a Russian border is absolutely paramount. He doesn't believe that Ukraine is a state. He doesn't believe it is a sovereign state. He believes it's an artificial state, a de facto part of Russian territory, and he will not rest until he ensures that Ukraine remains a buffer to serve Russia's security imperatives.
And of course, he's drawn closer to Xi Jinping. And I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are on what's been described as this no-limits pact that we've seen from Russia and China, what that represents to what we know as a rules-based order, and how does the rest of the world respond to that? Does Joe Biden's claim that America is back, is that enough to deal with this, what we're seeing now, as this more united front between Russia and China?
Well, Russia has been a disruptor to world affairs since Crimea, when it annexed Crimea and then invaded Ukraine. Russia is disregarding the international rules-based order, the way nations are meant to behave and towards each other. This has been in place since the end of the Second World War, designed to prevent a global conflict, and it's been successful. It's a rules-based order that's been promoted and defended and guaranteed by the United States and its allies. And China has been a massive beneficiary of this. But Russia, particularly President Putin, feels humiliated over the demise of the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and he is determined to ensure that NATO doesn't threaten Russian security. You will note that when Poland and the Czech Republic and Hungary were admitted to NATO membership in about 1998. It was shortly thereafter that President Putin became a leader, and he was determined that no other nation bordering Russia would become a member of NATO and hence be a location for hostile forces as he perceives it.
Julie Bishop, it's been a pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you again for giving us your time.
Thank you.
Now, President Joe Biden used his first State of the Union address to say his Russian counterpart has badly miscalculated in waging war on Ukraine, and dictators will pay a price.
Together, along with our allies, we are right now enforcing powerful economic sanctions. We're cutting off Russia's largest banks in the international financial system, preventing Russia's central bank from defending the Russian ruble, making Putin's $630 billion war fund worthless. We're choking Russia's access. We're choking Russia's access to technology that will sap its economic strength and weaken its military for years to come. Tonight, I say to the Russian oligarchs and the corrupt leaders who bilked billions of dollars off this violent regime, no more. The United States, I mean it.
Well, Russian President Vladimir Putin is rattling with the West right now with nuclear threats, and we are facing the worst geopolitical crisis, some say, since the fall of the Soviet Union. Well, joining me now is Sophia Gaston, the Director of British Foreign Policy Group, Pavel Felgenhauer, a defence analyst from Novaya Gazeta in Moscow, and Gorana Gergic from the US Studies Centre. Thank you all for joining us. Pavel, can I begin with you, because you're in Moscow and we haven't been hearing a lot of what's coming out of there and what people are being told and how Russian people are seeing this unfold right now.
Oh, yes, it's a terrific crisis. Everyone sees that. The Russian stock exchange has been closed and won't work today again. But it's not, stock exchange is not as important in Russia because not many Russians have equity. It's not, no one really monitors so closely as they do in America the Dow Jones. But the price of the dollar is very important. Since the 90s, the Russians have been always, even if they don't have dollars or any big amount, they look at the exchange points and want to see how the dollar fares, because they know if the ruble goes down, the prices go up, the economy tanks, and that's most likely what's going to happen in the next months. Russia is facing a very bleak economic future. There's going to be a recession, there's going to be shortages, there's going to be people losing work. It's not a very good prospect, and people are very nervous about that because they know that nothing good is coming.
Sonia, just listening to what Pavel has to say there, where is the tipping point? At what point does this begin to hurt Russia and Vladimir Putin, that it becomes difficult for him to continue, or does he achieve his objectives by then? Sophia, can you hear me?
Oh, sorry. I thought you said you were referring to the other panelist. Yes, so I think, one thing that's become clear is that Putin is not necessarily being motivated by economic stability or security. He's quite happy to inflict a pretty colossal economic impact onto the people of Russia. That's, is something that has become increasingly apparent as these sanctions, which are really unprecedented in their scope, reach, and the way in which they're being applied on the fly. So they are very much taking hold. They're proving as effective as we had hoped them to be. But the question of how that trickles down into Putin's kind of mindset and decision-making is less clear. Certainly some of the sanctions now actually trying to target military capabilities and effectiveness. So I think they're certainly trying to halt the advancement of Russian troops through creating an environment where access to tools and supplies are heavily constrained. That certainly could help. But I think one of the most striking things that we have noticed over recent days, of course, it's difficult to verify all of this, but there does seem to be a consistent narrative coming out of Ukraine that many of the Russian troops, particularly conscripts, have rather low morale. And in a way, that might actually be the most important factor in sort of switching the power dynamics in this crisis.
Gorana, we heard from Joe Biden today. Of course, during the State of the Union, he wants to put forward that strong sense of American resolve. But he did say this. He said that Vladimir Putin has underestimated America and the West, that this idea that there is weakness in the West. Do you think that's the case?
Well, certainly the State of the Union address that we heard today was one that was extraordinary in many ways, given that presidents normally don't start off their addresses to the joint session of Congress talking about the foreign policy issues at such length. And Biden administration thus far has really made its mission to repair alliances and partnerships that were badly bruised by the previous administration. Obviously, there were a lot of hiccups, as we know, and diplomatic imbroglios over the course of the past year. But certainly what we have seen, and surprisingly to many, is the united front when it comes to the transatlantic alliance and coordination over the imposition of sanctions, but more broadly as well, as President Biden stressed that partners are not just in Europe, but all across the world, and basically made this sort of case for the unity among like-minded nations, among democracies, and those countries that cherish freedom. So in that sense, there is certainly, again, a lot of positive news on that front of coordination, of cooperation among traditional partners and allies. But again, the bigger story, obviously, here is how this affects the situation on the ground, whether the provision of, military aid, of humanitarian relief, of these sanctions, their effects, and so on, will change the course of the war on the ground. And so far, we don't see necessarily the kind of halting that we wanted to see, but certainly this is the avenue that needs to be pursued further, given the aggression on Ukraine.
Pavel, what would this look like to Vladimir Putin right now? We hear a lot of reports that he's become increasingly isolated or impetuous, or there is this lack of judgment. What's your assessment of this right now, and what would he be seeing?
Well, mistakes have been made, and personally by him too, mistakes of judgment, and most likely he's angry because he understands he made mistakes. And they're very serious. They could have strategic impact. There was a mistake, and the operation began too late. Apparently, there were some reports, and maybe they were true, that the Chinese asked the Russians to postpone any kind of action with Ukraine till the end of the Olympic Games in Beijing. And anyway, the operation began just immediately after the Games ended. And it's too late. It's really too late. And you can see that in that so-called column northwest of Kiev. I don't think it's a column. I think it's a terrific traffic jam on a very narrow road, and the forces cannot move out their equipment into the fields because the fields are already wet and unpassable. It's more like the column of Romans in this film, barbarians. They're waiting to be sacked there. There could be, if the Ukrainians have enough forces to counterattack, there could be a terrific problem there happening. So that in other parts of the country, there's such problems because the operation began too late, and that was Putin's decision. But at the same time, you should understand that Russia still holds the initiative. And this is a very big country, and this is a big operation. Actually, there are two operations, one in the north, the other in the south. In the north, there have been serious problems. That's where the Western Military District of Russia is in charge. In the south, where the South Military District, headquarters in Rostov-on-Don, is in command, there have been a very serious progress. The Russians are doing well in the south, and are soon, apparently, will be close to cutting off Ukraine from all the seas, making it a landlocked country. They have taken a number of port cities on the Azov Sea, Berdyansk and Gnechensk, and also the city of Melitopol. These are quite sizable cities. They were not really defended, and yesterday they entered the very important strategic port city of Kherson, crossed the Dnieper, Today it's announced that they're in full control. Apparently the Ukrainian military moved out and Kherson was defended only by some territorial volunteers. Maybe they're still there, but the city is more or less taken. And now they move towards Odessa and Nikolaev and towards Romania, Moldova. So that's...
Yeah, thanks, Pavel. Can I just on that point? I want to bring Sophia in on this. Just listening to what Pavel's saying there, mistakes made, but success in other areas, and the information that we get out. We've been hearing reports from Ukrainians that there have been significant casualties on the Russian side. Sophia, I don't know if you've been paying much attention to this, but the information war, the PR war, if you like, as well. Who's winning that?
Well, I think it's fair to say the Ukrainians are winning that. And, you know, I think the world and particularly, you know, Western powers, I think in these countries have been really impressed and you know, awed and actually charmed, I think, by the Ukrainian people. There's been a lot of humor, there's been a lot of resilience and courage. I think that's been absolutely apparent. There's been really effective use of social media and really effective pleas as well to ensure that the information environment is, you know, this sort of social media frenzy isn't making Ukrainian troop movements vulnerable. So I think, you know, the Ukrainians have absolutely won the hearts and minds in this war. That's absolutely clear. The question about military casualties is a tricky one because, of course, it's in the best interest of both parties to emphasize larger casualties on the other side and potentially to minimize their own. But I think, you know, certainly there is a sense that Russia is being incredibly opaque with its troop casualty numbers. It's certainly trying to suppress that information, how it's relayed in Moscow, but also globally. I think there is a little bit of concern emerging in London this morning, just a little bit of reflection on the potential consequences of Ukraine having been so effective in this kind of information and PR war, just insofar as it potentially minimizing the significance and substance of the ongoing risk and threat. And just so I think there's very much a feeling that we don't want to be resting on our laurels now. This is still a very dangerous conflict. The other thing that has been just emerging over the past 24, 48 hours is a discussion in Westminster about the potential for this war really to become extremely protracted. And you've seen both the Foreign Secretary and the Defense Secretary coming out just in the past day saying this really could be an up to 10-year conflict and occupation.
10 years. Gorana, of course, some would say the conflict's already been going for 8 because of what we saw with the annexation of Crimea in 2014. What's your assessment on what we're seeing unfold here and the implications for this, if I could draw you on that, what it means for Europe, what it means for the post-Cold War Security Pact? Germany, of course, now increasing its military spending and providing firepower for Ukraine, which some are seeing also as crossing a Rubicon here. What are we left with at the end of this in terms of security, and how long?
Well, Karl von Clausewitz said that we should beware of fog of war, and reading into, you know, what has been going on as this major escalation unraveled over the past week, and trying to basically infer what this is going to mean for the international system, for the security architecture of Europe and the world more broadly, is something that, you know, anyone who claims that they have the answers, I would be highly skeptical. I might not have all the answers, but I do have some questions on that front. In terms of what you're asking about where Europe is going, certainly the impulses that we are seeing at the moment, and some of the sea change really in some of the key member states, like Germany, for instance, are pointing that we could see European Union that veritably grows into a military and a security power. Secondly, what we are seeing on the NATO front is increasing talk of enlargement in the wake of Russia's aggression, primarily to the north, potentially with Finland and Sweden being the next candidates, but also, the kind of talk of eastern and even southern expansion. Thirdly, what does this mean in terms of the international affairs more broadly? We've seen UN Security Council, which Foreign Minister Bishop has already talked about being crippled by this. So what does this mean in terms of the body that is supposed to basically ensure that there is peace among nations being essentially in a deadlock given the veto-wielding power that Russia has? And also questions about Stan around, if this is the end of globalization as we know it, whether the strength of countries will come basically from their ability to withstand economic pain rather than just having the strongest military. And we are seeing major rerouting of supply chains, of the way capital and trade flow. So all of these things, I don't have, unfortunately, any answers, but I'm sure that as these weeks and months pass, we are going to see a major structuring of the way that the world worked prior to 24th February.
Indeed, as you say, we're already beginning to see that. Thank you so much for that, Gorana, Sofia, thank you as well, and Pavel Felgenhauer in Moscow. Thank you. Well, Ukrainian residents are torn between staying to fight and fleeing for safety. Let's have a listen now to some of their stories.
Vladimir, be ready. We will come and kill you.
It's like a hell. We don't know what to do. We don't know what would be tomorrow, so we're running.
I don't know, am I going to come back or not? And I don't want to leave, but it's completely dangerous to stay here.
Nobody was prepared to this situation, and we believe that we will see them soon.
This is a residential area with no military objects.
All these people have to defend their family. We have to fight.
But it's a nightmare. All our relatives are around Ukraine, in Kiev and in Zaporizhia. They are spending the third day already in the bomb shelter.
I'm scared, but I can see another way to escape.
Russia, stop Putin. We don't want to fight. We want to be in our home.
Jeffrey Robertson is a human rights barrister and a leader in the global justice movement. I spoke with him earlier and put to him this question about whether Vladimir Putin is a war criminal.
Yes. Well, he's guilty of a crime against humanity. The second worst crime, the crime of aggression. It's not genocide, which is the worst crime, but it is aggression. It is invading a country, causing innocent civilians to die in their hundreds, if not thousands, and by breaching the United Nations Charter, which protects the sovereignty of independent countries. So there's no doubt that he's guilty of a crime against humanity, and there are other war crimes concerning the killing of civilians, which he's also guilty of.
Will he ever be prosecuted for it, though?
Well, the International Criminal Court has a very good prosecutor at the moment. His name is Karim Khan. He's someone I know, and he has announced that he will open an investigation. And that is important because although no one imagines that Putin will be put on trial in the near future, there may come a future, which has come for the old Nazis, it came for Milosevic. It may be 20 or 30 years hence, in which an old, crippled, maybe in a wheelchair, Putin will be wheeled in and will be prosecuted, given up by a new Russia that wants to unblot its copybook. So it's always possible, and it's important, I think, that the evidence of his guilt should be put together, should be amassed, and be available if and when that happens.
The problem here, when we talk about international law, and you talk about the International Criminal Court, is that Vladimir Putin points the finger at the West, and he said, if I did it, you did it too.
Yes, that's called the tu quoque defense. It's Latin, and international lawyers talk too often in Latin, but it derives from Nuremberg, and it is a possible defense in a number of areas. For example, tonight everyone is worried about the use of depleted uranium in the Russian bombs. Look, years ago, that is what NATO used against Serbia when it bombed Belgrade. So there is an element of hypocrisy.
And of course the invasion of Iraq, which he points to and says that was a breach of international law.
That was a breach of international law. And the first person to put his hand up to that was John Howard and Australia. Australia breached international law very happily without even thinking, following Bush and Blair. So, yes, there are hypocrisies.
So what's the difference?
This is different.
In which way?
Because it is an invasion without any possible defense. Putin has come up with genocide as the reason. There's no genocide. As an international law, I can say with certainty, there is absolutely no evidence of genocide, which is wiping out a race. That's not happening in Ukraine. There's been a civil conflict. So in reality, there is no defense for Putin's full, straight-out attack on a law-abiding country.
So what does this then reveal ultimately about international law? If he can do this and he can be in breach of international law, and if he is successful, he may evade prosecution. If China, for instance, can militarize and claim the disputed islands of the South China Sea in defiance of an international maritime court ruling, if other countries can invade other countries and breach international law without really permanent or long-lasting sanction, what is the strength of international law?
International law depends on nations and on the powerful nations.
And consent.
And if powerful nations do not consent, and the International Criminal Court, for example, has no consent from China, from Russia, or from the United States, it's all very well for Joe Biden to condemn Putin as a war criminal, but the procedure which the world order has for labeling him, trying him, is something that the United States has traditionally refused to sign up to. So we're in a very early stage for international law. And yes, there are hypocrisies, and yes, there is a refusal to consent to it. But one would hope, and it's just at this stage a hope, that what good will come out of this truly barbaric behavior is that other countries and Russians themselves will come to recognize that it is barbaric, that it is beyond the pale, and that particularly with the nuclear threat, my God, it's something that the world itself could expire if there is a full root and toot and shooting nuclear war. But it's something that's got to be stopped, and we've got to give more support and weight to international law.
Well, anti-corruption lawyer Bill Browder has spent 20 years battling Vladimir Putin and hunting Russian oligarchs, and joins me now. Nice of you to join us. We hear a lot about the Magnitsky Act and how that was framed to go after powerful people inside Russia. You were instrumental in that. Sergei Magnitsky was your lawyer until he was imprisoned and later died. For people sitting at home, tell us the value of the Magnitsky Act and how effectively it can be used.
Thanks. So the Magnitsky Act is a piece of legislation that's named after my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, who uncovered a $230 million Russian government corruption scheme, exposed it, testified against the officials involved, and was subsequently arrested, tortured for 358 days, and murdered in Russian police custody in 2009. The Russians covered their tracks, circled the wagons, and refused to prosecute anybody involved. And so I went out to governments in the West and I said, if they're not going to do justice in Russia, we need to create legislation to do justice in the West. And the thing we can do in the West is to freeze their assets and ban their visas. And that became known as the Magnitsky Act.
Is it effective?
It was first. It's very effective, and the reason we know it's effective is that when it was passed in 2012, Vladimir Putin went out of his mind. He went completely apoplectic. He banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families. He made it his single largest foreign policy priority to repeal the Magnitsky Act. He sent emissaries to Trump Tower before Trump was elected to try to get Trump to repeal the Magnitsky Act. And he's been chasing me around the world with death threats, kidnapping threats, Interpol red notices, extradition requests. I've become one of his most high-value targets because he's so angry that anyone could have the audacity to create consequences for his behavior.
That's fascinating, because what can be done now with the Magnitsky Act, and are we seeing this in the targeted sanctions? And from what you've said there, the idea of these sanctions and the impact it can have on Vladimir Putin, it can hurt.
There's no question. So the current sanctions that are being now imposed on Russian oligarchs is directly using the Magnitsky Act template. There's an absolute clean line between the Magnitsky Act passing in 2012 and the first sanctions list of oligarchs, which have come out over the last 48 hours. And this does hurt Putin personally and directly. I should point out that Vladimir Putin is a very rich man. He doesn't hold any money in his own name. The money is held by oligarch trustees. And so to get to Vladimir Putin personally and to create a real consequence for these illegal actions, the Magnitsky Act or these sanctions and the Magnitsky Act is the tool to use, and it is being used. And Vladimir Putin, for what it's worth, the moment that we announced that we were going to freeze the assets of the oligarchs, Putin was threatening nuclear war. So we know that we've found his exposed spot, his tender place, his Achilles heel, and we should now use it, ramp it up, ratchet it up as the atrocities continue.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you were at one point the single biggest foreign investor in Russia. Is that right? And so you understand the Russian economy intimately. At what point do we reach a tipping point? How long does this go on, and the sanctions, before it starts to hurt inside the country to the extent that people themselves start feeling the pinch of this and there may be some repercussions for Putin?
Well, in my opinion, people are already feeling the effects of this. You can see the lines at the ATMs. The prices of most consumer goods have probably jumped by 100%. There's going to be a massive economic collapse in Russia because of all this. So but I wouldn't bet, at least in the short term, that people are going to rise up and overthrow Putin. I think the purpose of all this economic strangulation is very simple, that we don't want to go to war with Russia with military. And so we need to basically cut off his ability to fund his war so he can't continue it. And to do that, we need to basically deplete him of all his resources. And we've done that with the central bank of Russia by freezing their assets. We've done that with the SWIFT ban of stopping trade between Russia and the West. And if we then freeze the offshore assets of Putin and the oligarchs, eventually they're going to run out of money. And they will be able to go to China hand in hand as a lender of last resort. But I still think that the financial capabilities of Russia in the medium term, and I'm not talking about the next few weeks, I'm talking about the next few years, will be severely limited. And so that is going to kind of has to be unless we want to engage with Russia in a real military conflict, that this is our best shot. at stopping him from doing what he's doing.
Bill Browder, it's been a pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you again for giving us your time, sir. That brings us up to the close of our program. Of course, we are continuing to follow this on ABC as we see the advance of Putin's forces continue. Some of the major cities and towns falling to the Russians, but meeting significant resistance from inside Ukraine as well. We want to leave you with these pictures now. These are pictures of aid leaving from Australia to go to Ukraine. Australia is part of the international effort resisting Putin's invasion of Ukraine. We heard from Joe Biden today that he believes that Vladimir Putin has underestimated the Western resolve. We're going to see the increased sanctions and the stepping up of that resolve in the weeks, potentially in days to come. I'm Stan Grant. Thank you so much for giving us your time.